Good evening, everybody. What a pleasure to be here tonight to get the holidays kicked off right. My name is Mike Moffitt. I get to be the associate pastor here. I get to dwell with you tonight in one of the Bible's all-time greatest stories. Raise your hand, actually, if you love a good story. Let's see it. Raise it up there high. There we go. I thought so, yeah. I see you out there too, kids. I love that you guys are here, ready to hear some story. That's awesome. Hi, yeah. I will say that I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so if you see me turn and clear my throat or take a drink of water, that's all that's happening. Or if my voice completely explodes, then Aaron can come read this for me, right, Aaron? Like Richard Rohr said, the height of Christian maturity is gratitude, right? And if you think about it for a moment, gratitude means acknowledging something first, and that is acknowledging our need. Tonight's story is really a story of need. This story has been told for almost 3,000 years. Almost 3,000 years this story has been told. Even by Jesus' time, the story was so familiar, so well known, Jesus was able to make quick reference to it, to allude to it. In Luke chapter 4, he refers to this moment in the history of God's people. It's been known by several titles, like Elijah and the Ravens, or Elijah and the Widow. You could even call it Elijah's Miraculous Meals. I think that's maybe a little cheesy, but probably Elijah and something else. Tonight, though, I'm going to try something new. We're going to call the story Life in 3 Courses. Thought that seemed fitting the night before what hopefully will be a delicious meal for many people tomorrow. Before we enjoy the first course, I want to paint a backdrop to the story so you know where we're picking it up. It's been 93 years since King David died. That King David, the giant slayer. And on his deathbed, David gave these words to his son, Solomon. He said, "Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways." Now, Solomon would do this at first. For 36 years, Solomon became known for his great wisdom, and under Solomon's reign, Israel experienced the greatest season of peace and prosperity in their history, even to this day, some historians would say. But unlike his father, Solomon did not remain faithful to the living God, the source of all life. Remember, our story is life in 3 courses. Leaving God for lifeless idols is like rerouting a river before it flows down to the farms and the cities. The inevitable result is drought, famine, and death when the only source of life has been cut off, or the lights have been cut off. Sorry, I couldn't help it. The spiritual drought, right, of leaving God behind, the spiritual drought led to a moral famine. You hear that? The spiritual drought of leaving God behind led to a moral famine as subsequent kings, starting with Solomon and kings afterward, immediately fell into civil strife. The nation of Israel split into 2 kingdoms. And the book of Kings, parts 1 and 2, tells the story. About 380 years from Solomon's reign until the people of God would suffer the consequences in what were known as the exiles. 380 years of history in these 2 books. Tonight, we enter that story early on, only 57 years after Solomon has died, at the beginning of the reign of the infamously wicked King Ahab.
Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe in Gilead, told King Ahab, "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word." Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go to the east and hide by Kerith Brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I have commanded them to bring you food." So Elijah did as the Lord told him and camped beside Kerith Brook, east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. But after a while the brook dried up, for there was no rainfall anywhere in the land. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks, Katie. King Ahab must not have been too fond of Elijah's weather report, since God tells Elijah to go and hide. I don't think that's just to go camping for a while before the drought hits, right? Go and hide, he says. But Ahab's hostile reaction is not too remarkable, really, as it fits a familiar pattern throughout the Bible of kings disliking what the prophets have to say. Same thing happened, actually, to Jesus himself when he spoke prophetically about the king of his time, King Herod. But there are two remarkable things about this first course that I want to show you. The first, of course, maybe famously, is the ravens. Lots of people may remember this story from Sunday school or Bible study because of that moment, that miraculous feeding by the ravens. A miracle is something that is highly unlikely or impossible, but which happens anyway, right? That's a miracle. So nobody can deny that being fed by ravens qualifies. Agreed? If you don't agree, then next summer, if you're on a hike, and if you take a break by like a little calm little stream, and you right before you dig into your Cliff Bar or your trail mix or whatever, right? If a giant 2-foot raven swoops down and drops a filet mignon at your feet, then we'll come back and we'll talk about miracles, right? If that happened, actually, it would kind of make me wonder which campsite that raven just stole that steak from. But if it happened twice a day, day after day after day, twice a day, that's miracle. That's miracle stuff right there. The grandkids would get sick of hearing that story eventually because I would tell it for the rest of my life. There's an even deeper meaning, really, to this event. Now, it's easy to get stuck on those miracles, right? But even Jesus says, look, don't look for signs and miracles because that's not really what you need to hear. You need to hear something even deeper than that. So there's an even deeper meaning here. In God's law, ravens were among the creatures listed that one should never eat because they were unclean. Now, in other words, ravens were never to be relied upon as a source of food. Are you sensing the irony? The same God who said that ravens could never be a source of food has now made ravens Elijah's only source of food. Why does this matter? Well, that's another remarkable thing about this first course. It's Elijah's solitude. It speaks to his solitude. God's provision through the ravens, yes, is a miracle, but note that it's not through something just a little more logical. Why not? What's the point? Why ravens? Why? Because it highlights Elijah's need to begin his career in solitude. You may not know this because we started right at the beginning of chapter 17, but Elijah does not come on the scene until the words that Katie started to read. That's how he comes on the scene. We don't hear we hear what town he's from. We don't hear about his family. We don't hear about his background. We don't hear stories about him before. He just appears on the scene, starting his career right here in chapter 17. And this is how it starts. It starts in solitude. In order to know God, the creator and sustainer of life, in order to know God, we have to have full understanding that everything we get is a gift. And the best place to come to that understanding is in solitude. Solitude, by the way, doesn't mean just being alone. Solitude means being alone with God intentionally, right? Henry Nouwen taught adamantly that all spiritual life begins with solitude. He said that, quote, solitude is the place in which we can listen to the voice of the one who calls us the beloved. He continues, if we're not claiming that voice is the deepest truth of our being, then we cannot walk freely in this world. That is step one. And everything else we do and everything else we know relies on understanding that we are the beloved. And we come to that in solitude. Over this Thanksgiving weekend, consider spending some time in solitude. alone with God. Take a long walk. Wear a raincoat. Get up a little earlier than normal, maybe. Or stay up a little later, anytime the house is quiet. Turn the TV off. Turn your phone off. Don't just silence that thing. Turn it off. All the way off. Consider how it will nourish your spirit to take notice of every breath, every heartbeat. And even when you are with people, you'll start to notice every bite of that Thanksgiving meal in a whole new way. And start to understand that each step, each breath is a gift from the one who calls you the beloved. Solitude is how Elijah's story begins, but he would not stay in solitude forever.
Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you." So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, "Would you please bring me a little water in a cup?" As she was going to get it, he called to her, "Bring me a bite of bread too." But she said, "I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die." But Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again." So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Lauren. So now things start looking maybe a little less miraculous at first. A little more normal, right? A little more familiar territory as Elijah moves from course 1, solitude, to course 2 of our meal, community. The brook has dried up, right? That's what happens when you have a drought. Brooks dry up. That's normal, right? And then Elijah does what was normal to move on because there's no more water coming. No miraculous resupply of water here. He'll apparently be fed by a person this time around. No need for miraculous ravens, so that seems relatively normal too, right? So again, seems like things are looking a little more familiar, but with a little bit of extra insight, I think we're going to see that there is nothing normal about this second course at all. First, there's the place. God directs Elijah to go to the city of Sidon. It's actually quite a ways from where he was on the east side of the Jordan at the brook, right? He actually has to go quite a ways. Now, Elijah knew something else about Sidon, right? This to us today probably means very little. You might remember a little bit from the Bible, but check this out. In order to retain a political relationship with that region, which was not part of Israel, Sidon was a city outside of Israel in a region called Tyre, okay? In order to maintain a relationship with that region politically, King Ahab, same King Ahab, married the daughter of the king of Sidon. You know, and you see this stuff in European history too, right? Like, I want to have a hand in the Netherlands, so I'm going to marry the Dutch queen. You know how that works. Well, the daughter, of course, of the king of Sidon, if you know the story well, anybody know Ahab's wife's name? Yeah, there's the Sunday school students out there. I can hear you guys. Jezebel, another infamous character from the Bible. Jezebel is the daughter of the king of Sidon, and Elijah is going to know this. So God says, I want you to go to a village called Zarephath near the city of Sidon. Pause for a moment as Elijah goes, what's that again? Where? Right? So we know how Ahab feels about Elijah, right? But Elijah's going to know how Jezebel feels about him in just 2 chapters from now. Jezebel wants him dead. That's what Jezebel wants. And Elijah is going to know this. So consider the place. not only a foreign place, not only a place that does not recognize anything to do with the God of Israel, but also the homeland of what would become one of Elijah's greatest enemies. But also there's the person, right? This widow is not an Israelite. She would not believe in or at least be loyal to Yahweh, the God of Israel. It's clear in her response to Elijah's request, actually. It's really quick and subtle. She says, I swear by the Lord, your God. If you have a Bible, you can check that out. It's a really specific thing to catch. I swear by the Lord, your God, that this is what's happening, right? And a very clear indicator, this is not my God, right? So the question for Elijah is God going to provide through someone who does not even acknowledge that he is God? Pause for a second again. If you know much about the New Testament and the ways that Jesus started to change the paradigm, consider this as 1,000 years before that. And always remember stories like this. Anytime somebody goes, I like the New Testament God, but I don't like the Old Testament God so much. You sure about that? Because the Old Testament God looks an awful lot like the New Testament one, if you know how to read it. So here God takes a foreign woman who does not acknowledge him at all and makes her the vehicle for his blessing. More than that, she's clearly impoverished. In that culture, a woman who lost her husband would likely be devoid of a source of income, definitely be devoid of an inheritance, making her destitute. Even more so in the middle of a drought and a famine, when food and water are scarce. How and why, Elijah might wonder, is a foreign, unbelieving widow going to provide food for me? Ravens may have seemed a little more likely to him at that point. Well, there are clear parallels between these first two vignettes. Elijah was compelled by God to receive. Note that Elijah has done nothing. He has done nothing but obey. But otherwise, he's just received. And now he's receiving again. So that's one. Another one is that this is only by God's provision from the most unlikely of sources. These two stories clearly parallel each other. But their similarities draw out a very important difference. First, Elijah was in solitude. And now, Elijah is in community. How is the first essential for the second? The holidays begin officially tomorrow. Is that right? I've seen a lot of Christmassy stuff around, but I've heard that Thanksgiving kind of is the beginning of the holidays. Everybody knows that amidst the fun, the holidays can also be a tense time, especially in communities like families. Now, I'm not so presumptuous as to try to guess all the reasons for relational tension during the holidays, but I am willing to guess at one of the ingredients: unhealthy dependency on other people. Indistinguishable roles, undifferentiated roles in a community lead to a kind of an unhealthy dependency. There's actually a psychologist who describes a codependent relationship this way. He says, in a desperate attempt to get one's core dependency needs met by other people, listen to this, their true identities are distorted and their development and potential is stifled. We were made for community and to experience God's provision in community, but in order for us to experience and represent God well in community, we first must know our identity as the beloved children of God. Again, Henry Nouwen puts it this way: community is not the opposite of solitude. He says community is solitude greeting solitude, where one says, I am the beloved, you are the beloved, and together we can build a home. They're not opposites. Solitude leads to community. Solitude fuels healthy community. And this is exactly how God leads Elijah, first in solitude and then into community. Can you imagine how it might transform the holidays as we interact with hundreds of people in one way or another, if we understood that we were first beloved and how that informs our interactions? Friends, family, to be sure, yeah. But what about coffee shop baristas, department store clerks, Uber drivers, flight attendants, Walmart employees, Black Friday Walmart employees especially? Are they going to know the difference between the Christians that they're serving and the non-Christians that they're serving? Will they know the difference between people who walk in there fueled in their spirits as beloved children of God and those just desperate to fill that void in their hearts with another product? I think they'll know the difference. This is why it's so important to see that God provides, yes, but he provides for Elijah in this story in a very particular order. First in solitude, and then letting that solitude inform his interaction in community. Nourished now twice, Elijah appears to be ready for his first real challenge.
Sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. Then she said to Elijah, "O man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" But Elijah replied, "Give me your son." And he took the child's body from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid the body on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?" And he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, please let this child's life return to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." Then the woman told Elijah, "Now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Yuliya. The final course of our meal together tonight is notably different than the first 2. There is no miraculous food, and Elijah doesn't travel anywhere. And rather than experiencing life, only someone in the community experiences death. Now, here's a woman and a son who are alive only because of God's provision. It's strange that the story does not record any words of gratitude from her. Not yet, anyway. Not for the bread, for days and days, right? Nothing of gratitude from her. But now when a tragedy strikes, she speaks up. Albeit, as any of us ought to expect, I think, empathetically. Right? She reacts emotionally as anybody would in that circumstance. What's interesting is that she's not just emotional, she actually voices kind of the exact opposite of thankfulness, which is accusation. She essentially accuses Elijah for her son's death, which doesn't seem fair. But here's what's noteworthy about Elijah's response. It's not what he does that I find noteworthy. It's what he does not do. Elijah does not get defensive. Elijah does not crumble as though he's some kind of failure. Why not? She points a finger right at him and says, "Why did you do this to me? Did you do this to me? How could you have done this to me?" How does he not just immediately become defensive or mope away as though he somehow failed God? Well, you know how. Because he's been nourished, first in solitude and then in community. He knows that God and God alone is the provider of life. He knows he had nothing to do with this. He knows this is not about Elijah. And so he takes the young man, takes the boy, and he does exactly what this woman does. He cries out to God. And he asks God the same question any of us would ask, the greatest of all time questions. He asks him, why? Why? Why would you let this happen? Why would you call me to this? After this it's like we do after we encounter the latest tragedy of the week, the latest mass shooting, the latest natural disaster, the latest personal tragedy in our midst. Do we not do the exact same thing? We ask God why. And when we do that, we are following in deep, well-worn footsteps. Even one of the greatest of all God's prophets did the same. But Elijah knows something here. He knows that crying out, even with no answers, does not mean that God has nothing for him to do. Think about that for a second. Do we engage in ministry when we know what we're supposed to do next? Do we answer God's call because he's mapped it all out for us and we get it? Is there any story like that anywhere in the entire Bible, save one maybe, and that was Jesus' own life, which he seemed to have a pretty good understanding of? No. And so we can't expect it either. But just because we don't know the future, just because God doesn't necessarily even give us a good answer, does not mean there is no ministry to be done. Nouwen puts it this way for a third time, Henry Nouwen. He says, the call to compassionate ministry is a great call, but we must not say, I can't do it. When we are aware that we are the beloved, that's solitude. And when we have friends around us with whom we live in community, then we can do anything. And that's why the third course tonight is called ministry. What is God calling me to do? Well, that's a good question that must be preceded by solitude and community. What does Elijah do? He cries out to God for answers. He gets none. And so he asks God to do what God has been doing this whole story. The God of ravens, the God of widows. He asks him to do the same thing he's been doing the entire story, which is give what? Life. You've been giving me life ever since I started, and now I'm asking for it for this person. And he realizes, too, that God's provision has never come in some kind of ookie-bookie, supernatural, ghosty thing. You can quote me on that. God's provision has always come through tangible means. It's always been incarnational, in the flesh, through the ravens, through the widow. Maybe this is what compels Elijah to do what sounds a little strange, which is stretch himself out over this boy 3 times as he prays, maybe to warm the coldness of his body. We don't know. But that's what he does. He gets deeply involved, empowered by God. Well, we know how the story ends. The boy's resuscitated. The woman acknowledges the God of Israel. I wish all stories ended like that. Happily, right? The Bible never claims that they will, and history bears witness. We live in a broken world where unfair need is a reality. So the main lesson tonight can't be oversimplified. It really can't. Hear me on this. If you've missed everything else, or if I've kind of talked you to death, listen to this. The message of this chapter cannot be oversimplified, as though we're supposed to learn that, quote, God will revive your loved ones if you just ask hard enough. That can't be the lesson. It can't be that if you get really, really hungry, God will bring you food from ravens. It can't be that. There's something much bigger here, much deeper. Even with the uniqueness of this last vignette, there is one common thread that permeates the entire chapter, and that is that God gives life. In whatever form it comes and for however long, God gives life. In this case, life in 3 courses: solitude, community, and ministry. And for that life, we give thanks. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we know that the life of Elijah is echoed later in Jesus' own life. Jesus, who began his ministry in solitude, in the wilderness, desperately hungry. Jesus, who moved from that solitude into community, calling friends together to know him, live with him. and that his solitude and his community enabled a life-giving ministry that gives us life to this day. We ask now that as you've given us this word, that we would be able to digest it as true spiritual food, as you lead us to know ourselves as your beloved, to find you in the love of our community, and to answer your call into ministry to bless your world. We ask it in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.